Thanks, Dubbo. And now the intent is to get into a bit more of the meat of how the force design function actually works, to provide you an insight into the force options and plans branch role in particular. I will do a bit of an overview, but all the technical and smart stuff will be done by Anthony, and he will talk through some of our important elements, particularly in regard to prioritisation and how we look at strategy, resources and capability, and ensuring we have a compatible process for that. Now, if we have time for questions after the presentation, we will take those. Otherwise, we can take questions during the panel discussion this afternoon. So, no defence presentation can be done without an org chart. This is a pretty small one, but this shows the division headed up by Air Vice Marshal Hupfeld, obviously working to the VCDF as the Joint Force Authority. Many of you may have heard of the VCDF's role, particularly through the First Principles Review, being referred to as the Joint Capability Authority. That changed recently to the Joint Forces Authority. That's an important distinction. It confirms again the authority that VCDF has in ensuring a joint force by design. He also is the chair of the Investment Committee, but he's not the commander or chief of joint capabilities. That is now done by Air Vice Marshal MacDonald. So there is obviously within Defence a new group called the Joint Capability Group, and they are responsible for joint enablers and other joint effects. So the VCDF no longer is a capability manager. He is chair of the Investment Committee and also the Joint Force Authority, which is an important distinction for his role. The three branches listed there, particularly the one I'll focus on today, obviously, is the Force Options and Plans branch. And you've heard from Pat Heverington, who works in our Investment Portfolio Management branch. He answers directly back to the VCDF, but has a role supporting and being supported by Head Force Design and the Force Design Division. Force Analysis branch, a bit of a name change here. They've gone from Joint Force Analysis branch to Force Analysis branch, FAB, great acronym. That's headed up by Dave Connery, and Dave will speak to you with his team after our presentation. So let's look at the role of Force Options and Plans. Now, I won't go through that in detail. I'll let you read the number of different functions we have within the branch. Just to know, there's three main directorates. Our Force Options Development Directorate, headed up by Group Captain Ted Schneider, really looking at those options development, testing the options, and then providing what we call a joint capability narrative, a tasking statement to the capability managers based on a requirement for a new investment in the actual investment program. We also have force structure assessments, headed up by Colonel Simeon Ward, and I'll talk a bit about what Simeon and his team does, particularly in regard to our capability program narratives, which are an important strategic document that are a translation of the force structure review into our new capability life cycle function. And Anthony, force planning and prioritisation. He will speak to you shortly. What I want to emphasise on this slide, though, is the term evidence base. The information being provided to the decision makers by Force Design Division must be grounded in evidence. The evidence chain between an option being proposed or a gap in opportunity being assessed and its translation into a capability outcome must be tied by evidence linking it back to strategic guidance. That's an important part of what we need to do to build trust in defence. And you heard Head Force Design and others speak about that this morning. One of the key outcomes of the FPR was the need for defence to rebuild trust, particularly with the central agencies and also with government in our decision making. And we all have examples, I'm sure, of where we've provided poor advice or poor recommendations to receive poor outcomes in regard to investment. Evidence base and also a great level of transparency in how we do our force design function. And that's a big change for us. We have central agencies, as you've been told before, as part of the Investment Committee, but we also have them very early in the piece in regard to our force design cycle. And that's a great outcome because the understanding of Defence's needs or tasks related to a new capability requirement are known very early in the actual strategy and concepts phase of the CLC. So you saw Pat show you this diagram, the 4 phases of the capability life cycle. A lot of our work, particularly in my branch, is in that strategy and concepts phase. And that's where I want to get the most out of this next 2 days, is in engaging with industry and academia and other stakeholders about how we work together in the early phase of the CLC before we even look at going into an acquisition stage in the program. So how do we define the problem? How do we understand it? And how do we understand the strategic requirement? Basically, how do we understand the what and why before we start designing the how? Now, this slide represents the effort of force design work across the actual white paper cycle. So when this was first put out, it was put out to demonstrate that after the white paper was delivered in 2016 with a force structure review and an integrated investment program, the majority of effort is about maintaining the integrity of the program, bringing into fruition that 10-year, $195 billion program as directed and funded by government. And then as you go through time, moving towards the next white paper, you start looking at more designing of the future force. But in reality, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And technology and strategic circumstances will always bring change to defence planning and defence investment. So our need to be very adaptive and agile was obvious from the start. So when we started up the force design cycle, we undertook to ensure that that glide path could be approached in a 4-yearly timeframe, as HFD has spoken to, in that 4-year fundamental cycle, but also, if we need to, very quickly in an agile mode as well. Now, what underpins that is a biennial update to government. So twice a year, the organisation, the department, provides government an update on how the investment program is being delivered. Now, that's an important part of our narrative with government in explaining where we have our focus on our investments going through the actual capability life cycle, so those emerging through the first gates, where we see funding pressures, where we see priorities changing, and where we see also unfunded or foreshadowed requirements. So by our assessment, understanding the need for new investment. Those biennial updates form key aspects in our own battle rhythm, which is part of our Defence Capability Assessment Program. And I'll talk a bit more about the strategy, resources and capability link, because that is obviously fundamental to Defence's decision on investment in capability and then delivery. So obviously our task in Defence is to respond to risk. I showed you previously the 3 strategic defence interests and the defence objectives that underpin those. It's about how Defence can provide options, as Michael Shoebridge spoke to government when called upon. But in that response has to be the triangle of strategy, resources and capability. Now, if any of those are incoherent, any of those lines of the triangle are not connected, then our ability to respond to risk obviously is negated. And that means our investment decisions, or indeed our strategic policy, will need to change. So what changes that? Of course, changing strategic circumstances. That might require a new white paper, but it also could be as a result of a resource decision. And where there is a lack of resource to deliver capability, then obviously we need to review our investment program and indeed our force design. So the model that's been developed has this premise in mind. Now I want to talk, before I show you the force design cycle and the Defence Capability Assessment Program, about the importance, as Pat Hetherington has spoken to, in regard to the program view within the streams. So there are 40 programs listed on that slide within the 6 streams. And as Pat mentioned, the stream leads are also capability managers, but in their stream role, They are responsible for integration, interoperability, and also for prioritisation within their stream. How can they manage stream outcomes, not just program outcomes, and definitely not just project outcomes? So what we've done within Force Design Division, we are written and writing 40 program narratives to support each program. They are living, enduring strategic guidance from the centre on the what and why behind those capability programs on the screen. Now, while we have 40, we're not set in that. That will change over time. More will come and some may fall off, or we might combine them. The aim is to bring the actual level of strategy and concepts up to the program and stream level. Programs may have multiple projects, but it's talking at a program what and why. What's really important to understand is that the capability managers listed on the left-hand side of the slide are responsible for the program strategy, the how. That's not our responsibility. But they must have their strategy nested with the program narrative. This is an important part of the cycle. So the Force Design cycle, as Head Force Design mentioned, comprises the four key aspects of assessing, understanding, designing and deciding. Around all of that is the role of defence industry and innovation, and I'll talk to more of that shortly, and also the role of contestability. Central to it, though, is strategic guidance and strategic direction from government that nests our capability decisions. So the Defence Capability Assessment Program. This is the program of activities that have been designed to allow us to have methodical review of the force structure over an annual cycle that allows us to provide those biannual updates to government and to make government aware of our gaps and opportunities and our priorities in that, but also to make government aware of our options that we are developing to address those gaps and opportunities. And this is not just about the force and being, the force you see outside today in the ADF. This is about the future force as well. So we have to look across a temporal sort of spectrum of today out to that 2040 sort of time frame, understanding what investment decisions need to be made to take the advantages of technology and take the advantages of defeating the adversary based on understanding feasibility of innovation, but also knowing our own gaps that need to be mitigated. So if you look around and start basically here at the 9 o'clock position, the capability program narratives I showed you previously, around that March period, they're being looked at, reviewed. They are living, enduring documents to ensure that they maintain a contemporary perspective to them. Important in those documents is the Joint Force Authority direction. This is where the VCDF gives his short, medium and long-term priorities to the program. This is where he uses his role as the Joint Force Authority to direct outcomes. So this is where we review those to make sure that they are still appropriate and they are aligned to strategic direction. Capability managers review their program strategies, and through that, they're identifying gaps in opportunities in delivering their program. We then look at those gaps and opportunities and how they may be treated. A key aspect is this role of force exploration and going out to industry. So most of you may have seen the latest round of innovation priorities announced by Minister Pyne. Well, those innovation priorities are in large part formed based on our analysis of gaps and opportunities. So we're helping shape the innovation focus areas so that industry knows where the priorities for defence are. We are also members of the Defence Innovation ecosystem. So I sit on the Hub Investment Advisory Group looking at the proposals coming in to see how those proposals align with the outcomes we're seeking through our gaps and opportunity analysis. It's also here where we look at divestment, as Michael Shoebridge spoke to. Key is also now the stream level review. As I mentioned before, the role of the stream leads is prioritisation. That means Chief of Air Force is thinking about not only Air Force, but Army and Navy when he looks at his stream called Air and Sea Lift, and making decisions about funding priorities within a stream outside his own domain. We then prioritise those, and Anthony will talk to you about the prioritisation process, and then we'll provide updates to government through our biannual update timeline. It then goes into an internal sort of review where we look at what this means to the investment program through the development of our force options. So what are the options being developed as a result of this, and what are the feasible industry innovation ideas that can be actually translated into outcomes as appropriate force options? Now, that's not happening in a 3-month period. Those force options that industry are helping us understand are being developed over a number of years. But when they come to fruition and realisation, we're driving them into the investment program. And then it goes through the Joint Force Authority and into our decision makers, our committees, and then back to government. I won't harp on the 3 modes as HFD has spoken to, but importantly, the agile mode allows us to have that spiral development mentality and to respond quickly to changing circumstances. That's a very important aspect of the role we do. So how do we understand gaps and opportunities? Well, really, we look at it from a demand and supply equation. The demands are the mission effects government has given us, the classified missions that sit nested to the defence objectives. How well over time do the capability managers deliver supply against those defence missions? So our connection to military strategy and to our defence strategy group, so into those both public servant and military strategy areas, is absolutely critical. So working with strategic policy, we understand what the supplier equation needs to be well out into the future. So again, temporarily, not just looking at today, but looking at the future force requirement as well, and understanding where we've got risk in able to meet those mission effects. You'll get some more detail this afternoon from Nigel McGinty from DSTG on a force exploration. But it is a key element of us understanding opportunity and breaching that gap between what is technology able to deliver now and into the future, and how can we bring that into investment options. And I showed you through the cycle where that is drawn in. But force exploration involves those blue sky sort of ideas, but also those closer in innovation proposals. And it's important you see this because we don't want to bound ourselves too much by only looking at today's problems. We need to be also focused on what the future technology holds for us. But those options must be achievable. They must be feasible. So we need to test with industry the feasibility of that. But importantly, we also need to define the problem. And I find in our experience, defining the problem is one of our problems. So how industry can help us in the definition phase is also very critical. So some of the areas of interest, I'll lay this out for you. These are some of the areas that have got our attention through our gaps and opportunity analysis. These have been translated, most of them, into the innovation priorities. Data management, particularly the large data that we are now being able to receive through the 5th generation capabilities coming into service. Looking how that supports processing, exploitation, and dissemination is a critical element. Of course, our cyber capabilities, and as you know, we now have an ADF cyber element within our Joint Capabilities Group, headed up by Major General Marcus Thompson, who is the Deputy Chief of Information Warfare, focused on cyber. SATCOM and other beyond line of sight capabilities. So just not about SATCOM, but how do we get other beyond line of sight elements or capabilities into the investment program. Additive manufacturing, automation, autonomy. Obviously, that is an area that we can see great opportunity plus divestment opportunity. Human performance, and the last one I list there is ADF lift capabilities. So what is the future requirement of lift in the ADF? This is where industry plays a role within the force design cycle. So seeing industry and academia, should I say, providing inputs throughout the cycle is evident. But today and tomorrow is about how do we actually realise that? How can we get industry and academia and other stakeholders talking very early in our strategy concepts phase, not designing the solution, but actually defining the problem and then looking at our options. So I look forward to the next 2 days in particular in understanding the role that we can play together throughout those phases of the force design cycle and actually how we translate that into actual tangible outcomes. So where are we now? Just a quick overview of the first iteration of the annual DCAP cycle. We just completed that stream prioritisation activity. So we're on track for the cycle and we're about to bring all those priorities into a joint review board. We're completing the program narratives. We're engaging across industry in Quick Look 141, which Josh Paulette might speak to today as well. We're engaging our allies. It's seeing contestability. We conducted our prioritisation activities to support our biennial updates and our stream boards, and we're conducting transparent prioritisation approach in that. Where we want to go, we want a shared understanding of our priorities and our assumptions. Critical to understand our assumptions together. We want to continue to build that transparency and trust and enhance our evidence-based and decision support process. Now I'll hand over to Anthony to talk through to you about some of the methodology that we apply in conducting this analysis.